No lawyer. You are completely finished. My brother mocked his laughter echoing through the tense Denver courtroom. He stood beside his attorney, a man who charged $1,000 an hour, overflowing with arrogant triumph. They looked at me standing alone at the defense table and saw nothing but a pathetic victim. They had no idea that the moment the gavel fell, one single document would spring a trap that would absolutely obliterate their fragile empire. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now let's begin the story. My name is Sienna Rogers. I am 34 years old, and right now I am standing squarely in the center of a grand, suffocating courtroom in Denver, Colorado. The air inside the room was heavy, thick with the kind of manufactured tension that only vast amounts of money and deep-seated family malice could buy. The polished mahogany of the defense table felt cold beneath my fingertips. Across the center aisle, the plaintiff's table was a chaotic fortress, piled high with yellow legal pads and towering stacks of meticulously organized discovery documents. And then cutting through the solemn silence of the room came the laughter. It was a sharp grating sound that bounced off the vaulted ceilings. It belonged to my older brother Wyatt. He threw his head back, a picture of arrogant triumph, utterly unbothered by the strict decorum of the judicial setting. Wyatt looked down at me, his eyes gleaming with the predatory satisfaction of a man who firmly believed he had already won a game I did not even know how to play. No lawyer. You are completely finished, Sienna, Wyatt sneered, making sure his cruel voice carried loud enough for the entire gallery to hear. I did not flinch. I did not avert my gaze. Instead, I let my eyes drift toward the front row of the spectator gallery. Sitting there was our mother, Eleanor. She sat perfectly upright, her posture rigid and unyielding. Her arms were tightly crossed over her expensive designer coat. There was absolutely no maternal warmth in her gaze, only a freezing, calculating emptiness. A faint, derisive half-smile played on her lips. She surveyed my solitary stance and clearly found it utterly pathetic. Eleanor had placed her absolute faith in the man sitting next to Wyatt. He was a high-powered, ruthless litigator who charged $1,000 an hour. He was currently leaning back in his plush leather chair, casually flipping through a crisp document as if this trial was nothing more than a trivial inconvenience. To them, my lack of representation was not just a mistake. It was a glaring admission of defeat. They assumed I was too poor or too stupid to hire a proper defense team. They saw a helpless lamb walking willingly into the slaughterhouse. But they were entirely wrong. I stood alone at the heavy wooden table, but I was not nervous. My hands did not shake. My heart beat at a steady, rhythmic pace. I had no bustling team of paralegals whispering urgent advice in my ear. Instead, I reached into my briefcase with deliberate slowness. I pulled out one single thin manila folder. I placed it gently onto the center of the table. The soft thud of the cardboard hitting the wood felt like a definitive period at the end of a long, painful sentence. As I looked back at my mother's mocking smile, a profound sense of icy calm washed over me. I allowed myself a fleeting thought, a quiet prediction of the total devastation to come. Eleanor was basking in her imagined victory right now, completely oblivious to the steel trap that had already closed around them. In just a few short hours, that arrogant half-smile would be violently ripped from her face. I knew with absolute certainty that before the sun set over the Colorado mountains today, my mother would faint dead away on this very courtroom floor when the horrifying truth of my actual identity was finally laid bare. If you are enjoying this drama, please remember to subscribe to Revenge Stories. Growing up in that sprawling suburban house felt less like being a family member and more like haunting a museum dedicated entirely to my brother. From the moment I could understand spoken language, the narrative was firmly established and fiercely protected by my mother. I was simply the quiet girl, the background noise, the unremarkable shadow cast by the blinding light of Wyatt's supposed brilliance. In a society that often unconsciously elevates sons to the status of minor deities, my mother made it her conscious daily religion. There was no room for my achievements on the refrigerator door. Every square inch was reserved for Wyatt's conceptual sketches and participation trophies. Wyatt was relentlessly paraded around as a startup prodigy. He was a master of throwing around flashy hollow technology buzzwords that he barely understood, but they sounded revolutionary enough to completely hypnotize Eleanor. He did not build actual functional products. He built glossy pitch decks filled with empty promises. And for these delusions, my mother joyfully opened her checkbook, funding him with hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years. She drained family accounts to rent him sleek downtown office spaces he did not need, and bought him luxury vehicles to project an image of a successful chief executive officer. Whenever one of his phantom companies inevitably collapsed under the weight of his incompetence, she never blamed him. It was always the market, the economy, or small-minded investors who just could not comprehend his visionary genius. Meanwhile, I found my solace in the absolute unforgiving honesty of mathematics and finance. Numbers did not lie. They did not require charisma, and they could not be manipulated by a charming smile or a loud voice. By the time I was in high school, I was independently studying advanced accounting and corporate finance, finding a strange comfort in the rigid structures of ledgers and balance sheets. When I proudly showed my mother my perfect scores in calculus, or my intricate financial models, she would barely glance up from her screen. She dismissed my passion entirely, waving her hand with a harsh scoff. She called it boring desk work with absolutely no future. She told me that counting other people's money would never make me important or respected. In her eyes, if you were not the loud, disruptive visionary standing on a brilliantly lit stage, you were completely worthless. But there was one person who saw straight through the suffocating toxicity of our household. That was my step-aunt Beatrice. Beatrice was an eccentric, terrifying, and utterly magnificent force of nature. She was a self-made commercial real estate magnate based in Colorado, a woman who wore tailored power suits, heavy silver jewelry, and a permanent expression of critical amusement. Unlike my mother, who valued the illusion of wealth, Beatrice valued the brutal mechanics of acquiring and protecting it. She was iron-willed, famously difficult to please, and she possessed a terrifying ability to spot a liar from a mile away. Naturally, she detested Wyatt. She saw his grandiose tech pitches for exactly what they were: expensive tantrums thrown by a boy who simply refused to work. When Beatrice visited, she completely ignored the shrine built for my brother and sought me out. We would sit on the back porch late into the night, drinking bitter black tea while she reviewed complex real estate contracts and I completed my coursework. She tested my knowledge, pushing me to analyze market trends and dissect corporate tax structures. She recognized the sharp analytical mind that my mother had so carelessly thrown away. One evening, after listening to Wyatt scream at our mother for more seed money, Beatrice leaned over to me. Her eyes were sharp like a hawk spotting prey. "Do not try to argue with people who live in a facade," she whispered, her voice a low, commanding rumble. "Let them build their houses out of cards. You focus on the heavy stone foundation. Use the truth as your sharpest weapon. When the time comes, the truth will cut through their fragile lies like a hot knife through butter." Those words became the cornerstone of my entire existence. I finally understood that my family was not a support system. They were a toxic black hole that would eventually consume everything in their path, just to keep Wyatt's delusions afloat. I knew that if I stayed, my mother would eventually try to bleed me dry to fund him. So the morning I turned 18, I packed a single duffel bag. I did not leave a dramatic note. I did not ask for a single dime of their money. I walked out the front door, severed every financial tie, and completely disappeared from their daily lives. I embraced the invisibility they had forced upon me and weaponized it. I moved away, put myself through university with grueling night shifts and relentless determination, and began constructing my own empire in total absolute silence. I let them believe I was a failure, a mediocre girl drowning in boring desk work, while I sharpened the very skills that would one day dismantle their entire world. My trajectory after leaving that toxic house was not a slow climb. It was a vertical launch. I channeled every ounce of my suppressed anger and sharp intellect into my education, eventually being recruited by the Office of Corporate Fraud and Asset Recovery, known within federal circles simply as OCFAR. It was the apex predator of the financial world. We were an elite, heavily guarded division of investigators tasked with hunting down the most sophisticated corporate tax evaders, massive embezzlement rings, and transnational fraudsters. I thrived in that high-stakes, ruthless environment. I possessed a unique ability to look at a labyrinth of thousands of dummy corporations and instantly spot the hidden threads connecting them to illegal offshore accounts. Within 5 years, I was leading my own task force. Within 10, I was appointed Senior Investigative Director. I spent my days freezing multi-million-dollar assets, seizing luxury yachts bought with stolen pension funds, and putting arrogant, untouchable executives behind bars. I wielded absolute silent authority. Yet for 15 straight years, my family remained entirely blind to my reality. To them, I was just a lowly, uninspired accountant, grinding away in a dismal cubicle. I never corrected them. Their ignorance was my impenetrable shield. While I was busy dismantling corrupt multinational conglomerates, Wyatt was busy dismantling his own life, one spectacular failure at a time. His highly publicized tech startups crashed and burned with predictable regularity. He launched a decentralized crypto platform that collapsed in 6 months. He tried to build an artificial intelligence logistics company that completely ran out of cash before a single line of functional code was ever written. He was hemorrhaging money at an astonishing rate. And every single time the creditors came knocking, Eleanor was right there in the shadows, desperately sweeping his massive failures under the rug. Through my own discreet channels, I watched as she quietly sold off our deceased father's vintage car collection, liquidated her solid retirement portfolios, and took out a massive second mortgage on her suburban estate just to keep Wyatt out of bankruptcy court. She was bleeding herself dry to maintain the absolute fiction of his genius. Then a harsh reality shattered our separate worlds. Beatrice was diagnosed with aggressive late-stage pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave her exactly 3 months to live. True to form, Eleanor and Wyatt treated Beatrice's terminal illness not as a tragedy, but as an agonizingly slow inconvenience. They visited her exactly twice, staying for less than 20 minutes, each time awkwardly hovering near the door and complaining about the hospital parking fees. They were merely waiting for her to die. I, on the other hand, moved into a chair beside her hospital bed. I took an extended leave of absence from my director position and spent every waking hour by her side. I managed her pain medications, read financial journals aloud to her when she was too weak to hold the paper, and listened as she dispensed her final ruthless pieces of business advice. She was deteriorating rapidly, her fierce eyes sinking into her skull, but her mind remained as terrifyingly sharp as a scalpel. On her final night, she gripped my hand with a surprising, desperate strength. She made me promise that I would never let her life's work fall into the hands of weak, incompetent fools. I promised her. 2 hours later, Beatrice passed away. The reading of her last will and testament took place exactly 14 days later in a sprawling glass-walled conference room at a prestigious downtown law firm. The atmosphere in the room was thick with unearned greed. Eleanor arrived wearing a dark designer dress that looked more suited for a cocktail party than a time of mourning. Wyatt sat next to her, violently tapping his expensive leather shoes against the floor, checking his gold watch every 2 minutes. His latest tech venture was currently drowning in millions of dollars of debt, and his investors were preparing to file massive fraud lawsuits against him. He desperately needed this bailout. Both he and my mother were absolutely certain they were about to inherit Beatrice's entire commercial real estate empire, a portfolio meticulously valued at $40 million. They had already started discussing which prime downtown properties they were going to liquidate first to cover Wyatt's impending legal disasters. The senior partner of the firm, a stern man with silver hair, cleared his throat and broke the seal on the thick envelope. He adjusted his glasses and began to read the dense legal preamble. Wyatt leaned forward, licking his lips like a starving dog staring at a raw steak. Then the lawyer reached the asset distribution clause. His voice remained perfectly flat, echoing clearly against the glass walls. To my sister Eleanor and my nephew Wyatt, I leave nothing but the consequences of their own extraordinary arrogance and financial incompetence. The lawyer read, not even pausing to look up. I hereby bequeath 100% of my estate, including all liquid assets, holding companies, and commercial properties, to my niece Sienna Rogers. She is the only person possessing the intellect, the discipline, and the absolute ruthlessness required to manage and protect my legacy. For a full 10 seconds, the conference room was plunged into a stunned, breathless silence. The sheer magnitude of the statement hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. And then the explosion happened. Wyatt leaped from his chair, his face twisting into an ugly mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He slammed his fists down onto the polished glass table so hard that the coffee cups rattled violently. He screamed that it was a fake, a completely forged document, spitting curses and demanding that the lawyer call the police immediately. He was completely out of control, throwing a tantrum fitting for a spoiled toddler rather than a grown man. Eleanor, however, did not scream. Her reaction was far more chilling. The color rapidly drained from her face, leaving her skin a ghastly pale gray. She slowly stood up, placing a trembling hand on Wyatt's shoulder to silence him. She turned slowly and locked her eyes onto mine. There was no motherly affection, no shock, just a cold, bottomless pit of absolute hatred. She saw her golden child's entire future going up in flames, and she saw me holding the match. "You manipulative, conniving little thief!" Eleanor hissed, her voice dropping to a terrifying, venomous whisper. "You spent weeks isolating a dying, heavily medicated woman just to poison her mind against her own real family. Enjoy your stolen money for the next few days, Sienna, because I swear to you, I am going to completely destroy you. I will drag you through the mud, I will bankrupt you in court, and I will take back every single penny of those $40 million that rightfully belongs to this family." I did not raise my voice. I did not justify my presence at Beatrice's deathbed. I simply picked up my copy of the will, stood up, and looked my mother dead in the eye. Let them declare war, I thought. They had absolutely no idea what kind of monster they were trying to fight in the dark. Eleanor did not waste a single second mourning her sister. Less than 48 hours after the explosive will reading, I was officially served by a private courier. The lawsuit was a breathtaking masterpiece of fabricated outrage and predatory legal maneuvering. They were suing me in civil court, demanding the immediate freezing and total transfer of the entire $40 million estate. The formal charges listed on the heavy legal parchment were absolutely staggering. They formally accused me of gross financial fraud, malicious psychological manipulation of a vulnerable elder, and the outright forgery of critical financial records. They painted a grotesque, highly detailed picture of me slithering into a dying woman's hospital room, whispering venom into her heavily medicated ear and physically guiding her frail hand to sign away her life's work. It was a complete assassination of my character, built entirely on their own boundless greed. To ensure my absolute destruction, my mother liquidated her last remaining retirement portfolio to hire Richard Vance. Richard was not just an attorney. He was a notorious apex predator in the murky, cutthroat waters of estate litigation. He was an old, silver-haired wolf who had built his lucrative reputation on the total psychological annihilation of his opponents. In elite legal circles, people whispered about how he had once cross-examined a grieving disabled widow so viciously that she suffered a severe panic attack right on the witness stand. She ended up entirely abandoning her rightful claim just to escape his relentless verbal abuse. Richard did not just win cases, he broke human beings for a living. He was the perfect, ruthless weapon for a family fueled by desperate, blinding entitlement. When the terrified process server handed me the thick stack of legal documents outside my apartment building, I did not panic. I simply stood on the sidewalk and flipped through the allegations, quietly admiring the sheer audacity of their lies. A normal person facing Richard Vance would have immediately panicked, mortgaged their soul, and hired a massive corporate defense team just to survive the initial discovery hearings. But I was not a normal person. I knew exactly how the judicial machinery operated from the inside out. I understood that bringing outside counsel into this fight would only obscure the perfect fatal trap I was preparing to set. I filed my official response to the court exactly 1 week later. In the specific section designated for my legal representation, I checked a single highly unusual box, Pro Se. I was choosing to represent myself. I would have no high-priced lawyers in tailored suits, no frantic paralegals, no legal shields of any kind. I was walking into the gladiator arena completely alone. Through the inevitable gossipy grapevine of court clerks and legal assistants, the news reached my family within hours. I could almost hear the triumphant, mocking laughter echoing from my mother's suburban dining room. To them, my decision to go pro se was the ultimate undeniable confirmation of my pathetic inferiority. They assumed I was entirely broke and could not afford a lawyer, or worse, that no respectable law firm would ever take the case of such an obvious fraudster. They genuinely thought I was surrendering before the war had even officially begun. That same evening, my phone buzzed loudly against my kitchen counter. It was a direct message from Eleanor. I opened it, the harsh blue light illuminating the dark room. "Your stupid arrogance is finally going to be the end of you," the message read. "Did you honestly think you could outsmart us? Richard is going to tear you apart piece by piece on that stand. When this is over, you will lose everything. You will be out on the street begging for scraps, and I will make absolutely sure that not a single person in this family throws you a dime. You brought this entirely on yourself." I stared at the glowing screen for a very long time. A normal daughter might have wept at the pure venom radiating from those words. A normal person might have felt a crushing weight of anxiety pressing down on their chest. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical, and terrifying focus. I did not type back a single word. I simply deleted the message, set my phone down, and walked straight into my home office. I had exactly 3 weeks until the preliminary hearing in Denver. While my family spent those 21 days aggressively celebrating their guaranteed victory and shopping for luxury cars they planned to buy, with Beatrice's money, I completely vanished into my work. But I was no longer acting as Sienna, the estranged and dismissed daughter. I activated the full, terrifying authority of the Senior Investigative Director of the Office of Corporate Fraud and Asset Recovery. I knew deep down that Wyatt's intense desperation for $40 million went far beyond simple startup failure. You do not hire a monster like Richard Vance just to pay off a few disgruntled angel investors. You hire a monster when you are terrified of going to federal prison. I pulled every single investigative thread I could legally access. Using the civil counterclaim discovery process as my perfectly legal Trojan horse, I subpoenaed the hidden banking records of Wyatt's latest artificial intelligence company. I spent 18 hours a day buried in encrypted servers tracing complex offshore shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands, straight back to hidden private servers in Wyoming. The deeper I dug, the more profoundly rotten the foundation became. Wyatt was not just a bad businessman. He was a prolific, reckless, and incredibly stupid criminal. I discovered that he had been entirely fabricating his active user data to secure massive rounds of venture capital funding. Worse, he was taking that investor capital and immediately funneling it straight into unregulated private cryptocurrency wallets to hide it from the Internal Revenue Service. It was textbook wire fraud, severe securities violations, and money laundering on a massive, undeniable scale. The $40 million from Beatrice's estate was never meant to save his failing business. It was desperately needed to quietly pay off his largest, most dangerous investors before they realized the entire company was a hollow shell and called the Federal Bureau of Investigation. My brother was exactly one audit away from a 20-year federal prison sentence, and he knew it. Over the next 2 weeks, I meticulously compiled every forged wire transfer, every deleted internal email, and every hidden bank statement. I printed them out, organizing them perfectly into a massive, undeniable 500-page federal dossier. Eleanor had promised that my arrogance would leave me begging on the street. She had absolutely no idea that I was the one who owned the pavement she was currently standing on. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom clicked shut, sealing us inside. The sharp crack of the wooden gavel echoed through the cavernous space, instantly silencing Wyatt's lingering, arrogant laughter. Judge Harrison, a man with decades of judicial experience carved into the deep lines of his face, settled into his high-backed leather chair. He peered down at the courtroom over the rim of his glasses, his expression one of bored authority. The trial had officially begun. Richard Vance did not merely stand up. He took the floor with the theatrical dominance of a seasoned stage actor. He buttoned his bespoke suit jacket, stepped confidently away from the plaintiff's table, and approached the center of the room. He did not look at the judge immediately. Instead, he locked his predatory gaze onto me, letting the heavy silence build before he finally spoke. His voice was a rich, booming baritone expertly calibrated to project righteous indignation. "Your Honor," Richard began, his tone dripping with manufactured sorrow, "we are gathered here today to rectify a profound and deeply disturbing tragedy. We are here to dismantle a meticulously planned, incredibly cruel deception perpetrated against a dying, vulnerable woman in her final agonizing days." He paced slowly back and forth, gesturing broadly toward Wyatt and Eleanor, who had both instantly arranged their faces into masks of dignified grief. "My clients Eleanor and her son Wyatt have suffered an unimaginable emotional trauma," Richard continued, raising his voice so it echoed against the wood-paneled walls. "They watched helplessly as their beloved sister and aunt was systematically isolated from her true family. And who was the architect of this cruel isolation, the defendant standing before you? A woman who saw a $40 million real estate empire not as a family legacy, but as a glittering prize to be stolen by any means necessary." I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the single manila folder in front of me. I let him speak. I let him spin his elaborate web of lies. "The defendant is a low-level accountant," Richard said, his voice dripping with pure, unadulterated contempt. "A woman who, by her own admission, possesses no substantial business acumen, no legal training, and no history of managing assets of this magnitude. Yet we are expected to believe that a highly successful, notoriously sharp businesswoman like Beatrice would suddenly, entirely out of the blue, leave 100% of her life's work to this inexperienced opportunist. It defies all logic. It defies common sense. It reeks of manipulation, psychological coercion, and outright fraud." He spun around and pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at my face. "She sits there today. Your Honor, arrogant enough to represent herself, believing she can outsmart the very legal system she has so blatantly mocked," he thundered. "We will prove beyond any shadow of a doubt that she preyed upon a medicated dying elder. We demand that the forged will be nullified immediately, and the estate be rightfully returned to the only legitimate heirs." Richard walked back to his table and sat down, looking incredibly pleased with himself. A low murmur rippled through the spectator gallery. I glanced over at the plaintiff's table. Eleanor was practically glowing. She offered me a slow, predatory smile, her eyes glittering with absolute triumph. Beside her, Wyatt was leaning back in his chair, his arms crossed behind his head, radiating the smug confidence of a man who firmly believed he had already won the war. They were absolutely convinced that because I did not have a high-priced lawyer shouting objections, I was completely paralyzed by the complex legal jargon. They thought I was a deer caught in the headlights, frozen in terror. Judge Harrison turned his gaze toward me. His expression was completely unreadable. "Ms. Rogers," the judge said, his voice flat and authoritative, "as you are representing yourself pro se, it is now your opportunity to present your opening statement and respond to the incredibly serious allegations of fraud leveled against you. Are you prepared to proceed?" I stood up slowly. I did not smooth my skirt. I did not clear my throat. I projected an aura of absolute unbreakable calm. "I am your honor," I replied, my voice steady, clear, and perfectly modulated. I did not sound like a frightened victim. I sounded like a professional who had just walked into her own office. "However, Your Honor, rather than wasting the court's valuable time engaging in a theatrical debate over these baseless emotional accusations, I respectfully request that we address a vital procedural matter first," I stated calmly. "Last night at exactly 8 o'clock in the evening, I formally submitted a sealed expedited counterclaim discovery file to the court clerk's office. I request that the court review this specific documentation before we proceed any further with the plaintiff's opening arguments." A sharp frown creased Richard Vance's forehead. He shot up from his chair, his previous smooth demeanor fracturing slightly. "Objection, Your Honor," Richard barked loudly. "This is highly irregular. The defendant cannot simply halt opening statements to introduce surprise 11th-hour documents. She is an unrepresented amateur clearly attempting to stall the inevitable because she has no actual legal defense." Judge Harrison raised a hand, instantly silencing the furious lawyer. "Overruled, Mr. Vance," the judge stated firmly. "A formally filed counterclaim takes absolute precedence regardless of the defendant's representation status. If Ms. Rogers submitted the filing correctly, I am legally obligated to review its contents." The judge gestured to the court bailiff, a large man in a crisp uniform. The bailiff walked over to the clerk's desk, retrieved a thick, heavy envelope secured with red federal evidence tape, and carried it up to the judge's high bench. The entire courtroom fell into a profound, suffocating silence. The only sound was the sharp tear of the thick paper as Judge Harrison broke the red seal. He pulled out the dense stack of documents. I watched his face intently. For the first 10 seconds, his expression remained one of mild bureaucratic annoyance. He was expecting poorly written, frantic denials from a desperate woman. But as his eyes scanned the first page, his brow furrowed deeply. He flipped to the second page. His posture changed. He sat up straighter, the casual slouch entirely vanishing from his shoulders. He flipped to the third page, which bore the highly classified official seal of the United States federal government. The color rapidly drained from Judge Harrison's face. His jaw tightened. The bored, authoritative demeanor was completely wiped away, replaced by an expression of absolute, unadulterated shock. He quickly flipped through the next 20 pages, his eyes darting frantically across the complex financial diagrams, the federal tracking numbers, and the undeniable evidence of massive corporate crimes. He was reading a meticulously structured, legally flawless indictment that had been built by an apex predator. Judge Harrison slowly lowered the document. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming in the ceiling. He did not look at me. He looked directly across the room at the high-priced, arrogant lawyer. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was no longer flat. It was sharp cold and edged with genuine disbelief. "Counselor Vance," Judge Harrison said, the words cutting through the silent room like a razor blade. "Do you have absolutely any idea who you are actually up against in my courtroom today?" Richard Vance blinked, completely thrown off balance by the sudden, intense shift in the judge's tone. He adjusted his silk tie, attempting to regain his footing. "I believe I am facing a highly manipulative, inexperienced accountant who is entirely out of her depth in a legal setting, Your Honor," Richard replied, though his voice lacked its previous booming confidence. Judge Harrison slowly shook his head side to side, a grim, humorless expression settling over his features. He tapped the thick stack of federal documents with his index finger. Then he looked at the bailiff. "Bailiff," the judge commanded sharply, "take this sealed dossier and hand it directly to Mr. Vance." The bailiff carefully carried the heavy file down from the bench and placed it squarely in front of the confused attorney. Judge Harrison leaned forward, gripping his wooden gavel tightly. His eyes burned into Richard Vance's pale face. "You are disastrously mistaken, counselor," the judge declared, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "You are not suing an accountant today. You are currently attempting to sue the senior investigative director of the Federal Office of Corporate Fraud and Asset Recovery." Richard Vance hesitated for a fraction of a second before his manicured fingers grasped the heavy cover of the dossier. He flipped it open. The first page was not a defensive plea or a financial alibi. It was my official, unredacted federal personnel profile. He stared at the golden seal of the United States government and the bold, undeniable title printed directly beneath my name: Senior Investigative Director. The color drained from Richard's face so rapidly that he appeared physically ill. His tan skin turned a sickly ashen gray. His eyes, previously sharp and predatory, widened in sheer unadulterated terror as he turned to the second page and then the third. He was holding a staggering 500-page confidential investigation report, meticulously detailing every single agonizingly illegal operation occurring within Wyatt's technology company. My strategy was flawlessly executed. By choosing to represent myself pro se in a civil asset dispute, I had secured the absolute legal right to conduct an aggressive counterclaim discovery process against the plaintiffs. I had utilized that precise legal loophole to legally import a fully authorized federal financial probe into this civil courtroom. The massive document Richard was currently holding outlined a terrifying web of federal crimes. The dossier provided undeniable proof that Wyatt was deeply entangled in massive securities fraud, sophisticated international money laundering, and the blatant falsification of federal financial reports. Richard's hands began to shake violently. The thick parchment papers rustled loudly in the dead silence of the courtroom. He was an apex predator in civil court, but he was absolutely nothing against the crushing weight of the federal government. He instantly realized the catastrophic position he was in. He was currently standing in a court of law, aggressively representing a prolific federal criminal directly in front of the exact person who possessed the absolute unilateral authority to freeze his own law firm's assets and throw his client into a maximum security federal penitentiary. "Your Honor," Richard stammered, his booming baritone voice completely shattering into a pathetic, breathless squeak. He took a sudden, massive step away from Wyatt, as if my brother had suddenly caught a highly contagious, lethal disease. "Your Honor, in light of this newly presented evidence, I must immediately request a recess. Furthermore, I am formally requesting the court's immediate permission to completely withdraw as counsel for the plaintiffs effective this very second. I can no longer ethically represent these individuals." The entire courtroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of gasps and frantic murmuring. "Richard, what are you doing?" Wyatt hissed angrily, his arrogant facade finally cracking. He lunged forward and snatched a handful of the documents away from his retreating lawyer. Wyatt's eyes darted frantically across the pages. He saw the printed offshore bank account numbers he thought were completely untraceable. He saw the exact logs of his illegal wire transfers. He saw the damning internal emails he had explicitly ordered his subordinates to delete months ago. The undeniable hard proof of his extensive criminality was laid out in black and white, bound in a neat federal package. The realization hit him like a runaway freight train. His mouth fell open, but absolutely no sound came out. The arrogant, mocking laughter that had echoed through the courtroom just an hour earlier was completely eradicated. He was struck entirely mute, his eyes overflowing with a paralyzing, suffocating horror. Sitting in the front row of the spectator gallery, Eleanor watched the scene unfold with growing panic. She saw the terrifying retreat of her $1,000-an-hour lawyer. She saw her golden child, the supposed technological genius, staring at a piece of paper as if it were his own death warrant. And then she looked at me. I met her gaze with the exact same freezing, calculating emptiness she had given me for my entire life. In that singular stretching moment, Eleanor understood everything. She finally realized that Wyatt was not going to inherit $40 million today. Instead, her beloved son was going to face a mandatory minimum of 20 years in a federal prison. But the most devastating realization of all was yet to come. She looked at the woman standing calmly at the defense table and realized that the invisible, unremarkable daughter she had spent 34 years despising and discarding was actually the one holding the power of life and death over their entire family. Eleanor's chest heaved violently. She let out a sharp, agonizing gasp, desperately clawing at the collar of her expensive designer coat, as if she could no longer breathe the air inside the courtroom. Her eyes rolled back into her head, and exactly as I had predicted earlier that morning, she collapsed entirely, her body hitting the polished wooden floor with a heavy, sickening thud. The courtroom exploded into absolute chaos. Wyatt screamed for his mother. The bailiff yelled for someone to call an ambulance. Judge Harrison slammed his wooden gavel, repeatedly demanding order. Amidst the frantic shouting and the terrifying collapse of their fragile, fraudulent empire, I remained perfectly still. I did not hurl a single insult. I did not scream in triumph. I simply reached forward, calmly gathered my single manila folder, and placed it back inside my briefcase. I snapped the brass lock shut. I turned and walked silently down the center aisle, my heels clicking rhythmically against the floor, gently stepping past the ruined, weeping remnants of my family. I had learned the most valuable lesson of all. The most ruthless, devastating revenge does not require destroying someone with your own hands. You simply step aside and allow the brutal, unforgiving truth and your own undeniable competence to do the talking for you. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Haley Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.